Let me welcome you all to the second roundtable on the trade policy India needs. We had an excellent first roundtable 2 weeks ago. Since we have a large number of speakers, and we had large number of speakers then as well, however, not everybody could speak, and we hope that everybody gets an opportunity to speak. And therefore, I had requested earlier as well that if you could restrict your comments to 3 to 5 minutes so that everybody gets an opportunity. This is a 2 hour session. We'll go on till 6 o'clock. At a review meeting last week, Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal called upon exporters to utilize the disruptions in global trade in their favor by occupying the space yielded by some countries. This all, as we know, is easier said than done. There is no gainsaying that India needs trade policy reforms to increase overall trade, push up exports, and better integrate into global value chains if it is to increase its share of world trade and boost economic growth at home. The need of the hour is concrete policy recommendations over these ends, taking into account the larger strategic considerations. Late last month, it was reported that the DPIIT is working on a comprehensive industrial policy statement touching upon many trade and investment related issues as well. Only a few hours ago, I had a meeting with Anurag Jain, the Secretary DPIIT, who said this industrial policy has been in the making for the last 8 to 10 years, and yet we are still going to see it. And he's now been instructed by the Prime Minister to get it through as fast as possible. Anyway, if this exercise adopts a coherent view towards both trade and industrial policies, it is a welcome development. And we need to wait to see how this shapes up. That is the main point, that we've done a project for the industries department looking at the issue about convergence between trade policy and industrial policy. And we're trying to see as to how we can make sense of it. At Kutch, we've been holding discussions with groups of eminent experts in trade policy since June, when the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO was organized. Since then, as Montek said, we have hosted various sessions on India's role in the multilateral trade system, then on its approach even towards the trade pillar of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and finally on India's domestic trade strategies. Today's roundtable will mark the final discussion of this series of rich debates. And we're going to come out with a very concrete set of recommendations for the Department of Commerce to take on board too. At the heart of all these discussions has been a single driving question. What is the trade policy India needs which can propel economic growth, particularly in the context of today's world, which is not a very happy situation? I also recently met Srimati Anupriya Patel, the Honorable Minister of State for Commerce and Industry, who was receptive to the need for evidence-based policy inputs to assist the government in trade policy planning, including for the new trade policy, foreign trade policy, which is expected to be finalized by March next year. To ensure a productive discussion today, I request once again to all our esteemed speakers to make brief and pointed interventions, headlights as far as possible, focusing on the specific questions on the trade policy we have raised. And we have sent questions to all the speakers, individual questions, so that we are able to get some very structured. Let me once again welcome and thank all present for taking out the time and joining us today. Some of you have expressed inability to stay for the entire duration of the roundtable. While I request you to stay as long as possible and hear other speakers, I'll try and call you within the opening hour of the discussion. I now invite Montek to make his opening remarks.
Can I be heard?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Pradeep. And I'm sure that I'm speaking on behalf of all of us when I say that we owe you quite a debt for having organized these discussions. One goes to many discussions where an individual paper is discussed, and they have their own merit because the focus is on a particular paper and the analysis is all on what that paper says. This one is more like a whole of the horizon type of approach where new ideas, different sorts keep coming in. And I think it is sufficiently important that you're doing a great social service by bringing a wide variety of people together. Now, I've said what I have to say earlier, but I'd just like to make just 3 or 4 points. First, you know, at the very core of everything has to be the assumption of why do we care about exports? I mean, is it just because we want to pay for imports? Because, if the purpose of having an export policy is that we must pay for imports, then an import substitution drive could actually aim at reducing our import dependence and would therefore make it less necessary to have exports. So I think we must be very clear. Uh, in my view, exports are not just meant to pay for imports. Exports are an indication of whether we are integrating with the global economy and demonstrating our competitiveness, and that therefore there is actually merit in increasing the degree of export, if you like, orientation of GDP. People can disagree with this, but I think let's be clear. Do we want the share of exports in GDP to rise and the share of exports in world trade to rise or not? So I would say that in our particular situation, that is desirable. And of course, there's lots and lots of evidence that many people have referred to in the past that no country has actually achieved rapid growth without rapid growth in export. So that sort of seems to support that point of view. One point. Second, many things are usually put forward as reasons why our export performance is not good, and they're not all trade policy. I mean, a lot of them have to do with what I would call infrastructure, whether it's roads, the quality of roads, the quality of ports, the time taken, all kinds of logistics issues. Now, these are not just necessary for exports, they're actually necessary for the functioning of the economy. So they help exports, they actually facilitate imports, they actually help all manufacturing. So I don't call that trade policy. I mean, that those are important policies. I don't think there's any dispute about them. I think the government is doing something to improve the quality of infrastructure that should be commended, but that's not trade policy. So I mean, I'm not going to refer to it, and I don't think people should focus that much on it. Now, what is traditionally called trade policy really relates to policies towards how open the economy is, which really means tariffs, which means are you going to join free trade areas or preferential trading arrangements or not? And secondly, what's your approach to the phenomenon of global value chains? Now, here is where I think there are propositions that, if people are honest about it, they would come out clearly recognize that some people say yes and some people say no. On tariffs, my view is that by any standard, India present level of tariffs are much higher than the level of tariffs of other well-performing developing countries. And secondly, we should, in my view, be very clear that these tariffs are too high and they should be brought down. For many years, we had followed the general principle that the tariffs should be brought down to the same level, let's say in East Asia. Now, having said that, by the way, for any individual item, you can always depart from the rule. But as a general rule, tariffs should be brought down. That's the question. Many people will disagree with it, and I think it's controversial. And it is important for your submission to the Commerce Ministry to take a clear position on this. Let me say this is not something that is part of trade policy. because finance ministry holds tight control over levels of tariffs. And so you don't expect don't expect the so-called trade policy to tell you anything about the government's policies on tariffs. And yet that is really a very critical part of trade policy. And I think that we are weak on that. And I think as it was Arvind Panagria who actually said after he took over as vice chairman Niti Aayog, he brought out a document where he basically endorsed the thrust of several previous governments that we must bring our tariffs rate down and we must reduce the dispersion of tariffs. And he has subsequently expressed disappointment that actually we moved in the opposite direction. So this is an important issue. I won't labor it. Second question. Is it or is it not important to join the so-called preferential free trade areas? Now, historically, we've tended to take the view that the solution lies in multilateral trade liberalization and not in what you would call plurilateral or selective trade liberalization. And I mean, theoretically, if we could do that, I think that is better. But I think we have to recognize that for whatever reason, the prospects of progress in multilateral trade negotiations is near zero. That's another issue on which some people might disagree, but I think you should take a position on that. I think for whatever reason, if there's going to be trade liberalization, it's going to be selective. That is, I think, particularly true given the geopolitical fractures that have arisen in the world, not due to our making, but they're a great reality. And one particular fracture really relates to China. For whatever reason, the extraordinary rise of China, which is seen to actually threaten the economic dominance of the West, has led to a backlash. Frankly, if it was only economic dominance, I don't think the backlash would be justified. But I think what they say is that China is not simply challenging economically, but is challenging us militarily and technologically. Nothing wrong with that either. But then what they say is China uses unfair methods to reach a technological superior position. I won't go into whether they're right or not, but that is their perception. So therefore, it is very unlikely that that position is going to change. And the US has very recently imposed highly discriminatory treatment against China. So we have to take this as a fact. If that is so, then the rest of the world is sort of getting divided up into preferential areas. And almost certainly, if we're going to have some development of global value chains, investment, and this kind of stuff, is going to be directed preferentially towards what the US fellows often call friend shoring. Friend shoring basically is a grouping that they like. And so the question is, what should be our policy? Now, I was always in favor of joining RCEP. Many people didn't think it was the right thing to do. And one of the reasons they didn't think it was the right thing to do was that they saw China as an unfair competitor and they didn't want to extend free, open trade access to China. Fair enough. But if that is the case, then we cannot be ruling out integration with East Asia, which is going to be the fastest growing part of the world. So if we don't want to be in RCEP, we still have that open. I mean, India can join RCEP if it wants. But if we don't want to join RCEP because China is the problem, then we should join the other one, which is the comprehensive whatever partnership thing, which the Japanese are currently leading. We don't seem to be willing to do that either. And one of the reasons we're not willing to do that is that these arrangements increasingly involve back of the border alignment of standards. Now, obviously, back of the border alignment of standards raise different kinds of issues. You can get hung up on this by saying this is unfair and we simply don't agree. But then what it amounts to saying is that if the rest of the world is moving in this direction, we are going to cut loose and do our own thing. I think that would be a mistake. What is more important is that, by staying out, we don't actually make it terribly easy to get in later, because by staying out, new rules, etc., get evolved, which might determine the responsibilities of those who want to take advantage. If we were in, we could actually make sure that these rules move in the direction that we want. By staying out, we have no control in that whatsoever. So this is another issue that you need to take up. There's a lot of talk about accelerating the FTAs with the UK and Europe. I think that's important. We should do that. For some reason, obviously, progress has been not as good as was at one stage stated, but that's not a substitute. I think we should get into those. Those, by the way, will require some concessions in the back of the border alignment of standards. But I think if you're talking about Asia, then we are left out in an important sense. So that's my next point. My last point really relates to we've got to come to grips with what is our position on global value chains. At one stage, there are statements that the government has made which say that we're in favor of integrating with global value chains. But somehow, at times, the impression being given is that we think we can do that with a global value chain, where the value chain is entirely internal. In other words, the value chain is a series of backward integrations all within India. I don't think that that's actually feasible. The meaning of global value chains is that global production will be distributed around the world, and goods will move more or less seamlessly from one part of the world to the other part of the world. Now, to do that, you need tremendous speed with which imports can come and go. That has to do with logistics, etc. But you also need a low tariff regime. It is going to be very difficult to persuade anyone to think of India as an important part of the global value chain if we also say that the average tariff in India is twice that which it is in East Asia. I think we should also get the facts right. I mean, if all this I'm saying is just conceptual or theoretical, if all this could be combined with a factual statement that exports are booming, then we could forget all this. The fact is, exports are not booming. For the last several years, by any standards, export performance is worse than it was earlier and is worse than it is for many other countries which are benefiting from the China plus one transition. So I think we better wake up and smell coffee. And that does call for a new trade policy. Now, I'm quite sure that the new trade policy will have a number of slogans which will look good. And that's good. But the important thing is go behind the slogans. What are the specific difficult decisions that we are willing to take, or rather, which you would recommend the government to consider in the light of some of the things I've discussed? I apologize for having taken so long, but then I promise to just shut up from now onwards. Thank you very much, Pradeep.
Thank you, Montek. It's always such a pleasure to hear you and your very erudite and sensible remarks. It's difficult to intervene, especially when moderate the session. Uh, my request is now to Gopal Agarwal, the economic spokesperson for BJP. But before I invite you, Gopalji, can I? Raju Kanodia has 1 minute intervention to make on Montek's speech, if I may allow. Is it okay? Go ahead, Raju. Raju, over to you for 1 minute.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I really appreciate. I am probably the only person from industry in this group. And I don't know how I find myself here among such intellectuals and thinking minds. But, responding to Montek, because I wanted to do that, because I think Indian industry is, I'm also not the right representative, because I would like to say that contrary to what many of my industrial friends would very much like to see, which is continued shelter under tariffs and barriers and all kinds of things. I personally am a person who believes in exactly what Montek has said. I do believe that our tariffs need to come in line. They need to be in line with ASEAN. I do believe that we need to stop, giving medicines to and ignore the cancer, which is really competitiveness, whether it be logistics, whether it be other cost of doing business. I think that's also very critical. And I also think it's very, very important that we have kind of chosen to remain away from things like RCEP, and we have ignored the trade pillar of the Indo-Pacific Economic Cooperation Agreement. And I think this goes completely against the grain of
Thank
integrating
you,
globally.
Raju. I'll come
So
back to
that's
you.
it.
I
Yeah.
think your response to Monte is very good. Over to you, Gopalji.
Namaskar. Namaskar, Montek ji, Manish ji, and I thank Cuts for giving me this opportunity. Briefly, I have been participating in the debates organized by Pradeep ji and his team, and they have been very informative and has been encouraged, increased my knowledge on the issue. What I want to say as an opening remark is that I agree with Montek ji when he says that when in 1991, when we liberalized, import substitution was very easy path that liberalization took, and now there are no that kind of fruits available, low-hanging fruits available to our economy to grow, and we need to, at the juncture where we are, we need to integrate our manufacturing sector with the global and regional supply chain. And therefore, there are 2-3 things that I would like to underline. That is very important because Raju Kanodia ji has also pointed out, and my interaction with industry people has been that they agree that we need liberalization, but the timing is always a concern for them because they point out several logistic constraints and challenges domestically. Some have been pointed out by Montek Singh ji. And our policy in last 5, 6, 7 years has been that make our domestic industry competitive before we go for full-fledged opening our domestic industry to global competition. So whether because industries are saying that we have so many challenges with regard to logistic bottlenecks, supply chain, domestic supply chains, raw material, transportation, integrated transportation hubs. So many things have been there, which the government is trying to substantially reduce them. Then there are problems with issues like this energy prices also is not competitive globally. We have to depend a lot, and that is though the consumer, retail consumer gets a preferential treatment in petroleum prices, but industries and other have to bear the blunt of global increased prices. So that energy cost is also not letting us to be competitive. Interest rate is issue. Then land cost and availability of land is also an issue. So these are complex issues which first we have to resolve. That is the priority that people think, and then open up. And there are domestic pressures about tariffs, etc. But we have seen that they have become counterproductive, increasing custom duties without getting into the details, as Ahluwalia ji has said, that commodity prices have risen so high that MSME now are coming for some past months, that period, that the commodity prices which are raw material for us is harming us. So we have seen the counterproductiveness of increasing tariffs. So that's also an important issue. So what I think is, it is not when to open up of the industry. At present, we have no choice. We have to open up. But there are 2-3 domestic challenges, how to meet them first, one thing. Second is our participation in global trade is so low. It is only less than 2% in the global trade. So how impactful can our policies be? That's also an issue that I think is important thing. And the third point that I would like to underline is that it is not only mercantile or manufacturing sector integration with the global supply, though we need it. But at international trade negotiation, etc., we find that there are pressures to open up the manufacturing sectors. But when we talk about services and agriculture, there are reservations from them. So ultimately, trade agreement or multilateral trade agreement or bilateral trade agreement have to be give and take. And that in that bargain, we find that it is not balanced at times. So this is an important point we have to consider. And I agree that at this point of time, we have good opportunities. If we integrate our manufacturing to the global and regional supply chain, surely, because the world economy is going through a period of recession and high inflation. US is continuously going for high interest rates. That gives an opportunity for India, even with regard to domestic industries to grow. Then China is facing post-COVID bottlenecks about lockdown and other thing, and Europe is facing intense challenges on energy thing. So these three big developed economies are at present in a situation which can benefit our domestic economic growth. So I think this is right time we should go for more FTA, free trade agreement, bilateral trade agreement, and also look into various mechanisms. We have to also develop certain capabilities with regard to, because at international laws and arbitration, etc., international laws do not have the teeth for implementation at point of time. There also we need to develop at the government level or at the industry level, association level, capabilities to deal with international arbitrations and other issues. So these are the things I think with this opening remark, I would like to listen other things, but I am agreeing that we need to open up and get more data on, as has been mentioned in some of the report, that we need to have more data on the value added side also to deal with the international negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are two things which I thought important to flag at this point, Gopalji, and as Montek has suggested. Now, indeed, flanking policies are also equally important for us to address. And in terms of logistics, this government has done some excellent, taken some excellent steps, including the Gati Shakti, which forces various branches of the government to stop thinking in silos and working together. I think there's a point to be made. May I now request Ajit Ranade, who could not join us the last session. Ajit? Hello, Ajit. Are you
Yeah,
there?
hi. Yeah. Hi, Pradeep.
Hi. Welcome, Ajit. Well, what
Thank
is
you.
the most important step that the government should take to ensure that enhanced export performance is accompanied by expansion of employment in sectors, including labor-intensive sectors?
Well, just give me 2 minutes to state some stylized facts. So hello to everybody, and Montek, Gopalji, and everybody else, Harsha, so many friends and familiar faces. I just want to state 2 or 3 stylized facts. Number one is India's exports do better in responding to income rather than prices. That is, the income elasticity of our exports is much higher than price elasticity. So it's not as if our goods are cheaper for foreigners or our exchange rate becomes cheaper for foreigners, our exports do better. In fact, they do better when world incomes are growing strongly. So world GDP outlook, the developed countries' economic growth matters more than prices of Indian goods and the exchange rate. This is a stylized fact. Second, over a long period of time, actually our trade and especially exports to non-FTA countries has done in fact better than FTA countries. This may have changed in recent times, So FTA has not been a very significant variable in contributing to our strong export performance. In fact, our largest trading partners, which is USA, China, or UAE, we don't have an FTA with any of those three. UAE, something is in the works, but technically we don't have an FTA. So if that is something to keep in mind. These are the stylized facts over long periods of time. Things are changing, but I do believe that's important. Fourth stylized fact is, where are we export competitive in the world today? Even as PLI is unfolding, even as many reforms have been undertaken, ease of doing business, even as logistics, addressing logistics costs, which are a very big deadweight burden on India's not just export but manufacturing. Where are we doing well? Well, a fantastic performance by our IT and software. I think they're clocking $185 billion this year, and we are on track to reach $250 billion, notwithstanding the slowdown. So clearly, of course, that's not an employment intensive sector, but it's really fantastic performance. The other one I'd like to mention, sort of attendant or sort of close relative, is $100 billion of remittances every year. They are nothing but de facto labor export. They typically come from blue-collared workers. They're highest in the world, ahead of China. We won't discuss whether it's a badge of honor or not, but I think it's a very significant contributor to our earnings, and I count it as labor exports. And thirdly, auto components. I believe our auto components production domestically is 4 times our domestic requirement. Maybe it's that gap has reduced. So that's also a sector which is competitive globally. And then, of course, there is pharmaceuticals. But I want to not mention things like petroleum and diesel exports, or gems and jewelry, or to some extent pharmaceuticals also, because the value addition there is small, but not to deny that they are significant contributors. So we should look at that. That's a stylized fact, and this has happened over many years. It's, again, not a very recent phenomenon. So these are stylized facts. One more thing I want to add before answering your question, Pradeep, is what Montek mentioned, which I strongly endorse, that let us not look at exports as merely paying for our imports. That kind of approach will not help us, especially if you're interested in sustained, high, and inclusive growth. And we cannot have that situation without a very significant contribution from exports, and with a significant contribution from exports, which is not merely driven by having to pay for imports, inevitable imports like crude oil. So that kind of is a change in mindset. So having said all that, I think what is the most important thing? There's no answer to that question, because there are numerous things, and I certainly don't want to say there's a silver bullet. But I do want to mention that we must seriously reconsider our participation in Asian treaties like RCEP, because it's not really about our trade performance, trade improvement, or the mutual deficit. It's more about location of value chains, global value chains, and if we remain outside, what we do is we actually deter potential investors who will want to locate the entire value chain in a relative free trade territory. So if only one country or one part of the value chain is outside, surely they're going to think twice before actually locating parts of the value chain, because then you are going to cross borders back and forth, and frictions are unnecessary. So while we just focus on the fact that ASEAN trade deficit has perhaps increased, I'm not so sure, because imports and exports have increased. We look at the China angle, but we completely ignored in the discussion, I think, what we lose out in terms of location of investments, where the entire value chain will be in the free trade territory. And last point is that this is it's after Galwan, it's becoming difficult to defend this, but China is now a $6 trillion consumer market, and more than 120 countries export to China. They're exporters to China. I don't know why we can ignore that market completely. So we have to be aggressive in trying to target. I know there are very many difficulties, but in all our discussions, we focus on EU, Canada, Australia, but surely we should not ignore the second largest consumer market in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajit. And with that, let me add that our trade with China is actually going up every year. Fine. I mean, our deficit is also going up every year. And
But
I think
but
that
Pradeep, if I can just quickly rebut that, we have a $32 billion surplus with one country, while we have a $45 billion trade deficit with China. We never talk about the $32 billion trade surplus with another country. You know, if we start doing this
the
bilateral trade
importing
balance,
country complains about it.
yeah, the US,
The US
and that's
complains
growing.
about it. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
agree. Yeah. Thanks a lot. With that, may I now request Honorable Manish Tiwari, former minister in the UPA government and another dear friend, to please tell us how can we ensure a greater role for Parliament? I think this is what is missing quite often in trade policy making is to scrutiny. How will it help improve the trade policy making process? Over to you, Manish.
Good evening, Pradeep ji, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Gopal ji, Lakshmi ji, Mr. Chandrasekhar, and many other extremely eminent people who are present virtually today. Frankly, I am completely a novice when it comes to trade policy. So therefore, I was here more on a listening brief rather than a speaking brief. But in my very limited understanding, what I have been able to discern is that your trade policy ultimately is a subset or a function of the geopolitical reality that you currently inhabit. Between 1991 and the economic meltdown of 2008, there was a completely different landscape globally. The neoliberal economic order was dominant, and so therefore you had a completely different conception of how goods and services should move, how tariff barriers should come down, how trading arrangements should be multilateral, how multilateral trading institutions should be strengthened. But post the global economic meltdown in 2008, and gradually from then onwards, we have, or the world really entered into a completely different phase altogether. And I guess what has happened since 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the kind of aggressive moves that China made during the pandemic, not only qua India, but even in the East China Sea and vis-a-vis Hong Kong, that all seems to have altered the landscape. And of course, now the war between, or the Russian aggression of Ukraine has complicated things in the West also. Having said that, I would tend to agree with what Mr. Ahluwalia, for whom I have the greatest personal respect, said, and I had articulated this in Parliament also, that not joining RCEP was a mistake. And the reason why I say that is not primarily from an economic or a trade point trigger, but if you really want to see yourself as an Asian power and not to be engaged in the multilateral trading arrangements in East and South Asia, which are currently taking shape, or which took shape as a consequence of RCEP, I think undermines and diminishes our position even in strategic terms. I fail to understand, though I've been trying to follow the commentary on that why have we opted out of even the IPF negotiations? So therefore, there seems to be a marked reluctance to engage multilaterally in larger trading forums. And I think that also somewhere reflects on us, on our confidence that we have in ourselves as a nation. And given the fact that for the foreseeable future, the growth is really going to come out of the East and not so much out of the West, even if we try and energize locked FTAs with the EU, which have been pending since the middle of the first decade of the of 2000s, or even try and enter into some other FTAs with West European countries or with Great Britain, I think that's not going to substitute for the fact that we just can't take our eye off the ball insofar as East Asia and North Asia are concerned. So therefore, I think there is a need for government to really sit back, try and recalibrate. All of us understand the China challenge. All of us understand the fact that there are apprehensions that we have. But within the multilateral framework, I think we need to find the safeguards. We need to try and build the firewalls which insulate us without really having to disengage. Where Parliament fits into the entire trade policy paradigm is that Parliament, in fact, is a microcosm of the diversity of India. So therefore, you have members of Parliament who try and bring the very, very specific concerns or the very specific interests and capacities which their respective areas have. And so therefore, if you try and involve Parliament more proactively in first explaining to them that what is the importance of a trade policy with regard to India's growth prospects, and number two, as to how their very, very specific areas and the capacities which they have can really dovetail into this effort, I think would only enrich and add to the discussion around trying to get a trade policy right. In fact, if I remember from all the years that I've spent in Parliament, I don't recall a single discussion which has taken place on India's trade policy. It may have happened in the Standing Committee of Commerce, but to the best of my recollection, I am not able to really recall even a single discussion or even government, whether it was us or it is now the NDA BJP government, trying to explain what really a trade policy really means or it entails to the representatives either in the lower house or in the upper house of Parliament. So I think there is a need not only for government, but also for organizations like the CUTS, for other experts who understand this area, to engage more proactively with interested members of Parliament. And I use the word interested, quote unquote, because given the cut and thrust of retail politics, there's hardly any bandwidth available on these issues among our colleagues. But suffice to say, I think CUTS and Mr. Mehta, you've taken a very important initiative. And if this group is able to come up with some concrete recommendations, which government is prepared to take on board, because what I also learned in my little time that I've spent in government is that government has actually made itself knowledge proof. It does not allow anything from outside to permeate into its echelons, lest it pollute it. So therefore, we have this situation where government considers itself to be the repository of all knowledge. But be that as it may, if there is something substantive which can really filter in, I think it really would be a huge contribution to India's national interest. And I would leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manishi, and we'll certainly take up your invitation to and do once the recommendations are finally, we'll probably hold a parliamentarians meeting, and we'll seek your help to do that. With that, may I now request Mr. Kem Chandrasekhar, our former cabinet secretary, two questions to you, Shekhar. One is, what should be India's approach to social issues and FTAs, the environment and labor standards? If you're talking about EU-India FTA, it becomes a very important thing. Secondly, and since you have been at the top of the government since for long, Do you think there is a need for a standing body for year-round trade policy consultation with representatives from industry and business, civil society groups, parliament, trade unions, etc.? Over to you.
Thank you, Pradeep. I speak on the basis of my 20 years experience, direct experience, hands-on experience in marketing, exporting, negotiating, and rulemaking in all the major areas, out of which 14 years I spent in the Ministry of Commerce, most of it in the Trade Policy Division, then in Brussels, then in Geneva. Now, my experience has taught me a few lessons which I thought would be of relevance in this discussion. I will, of course, take up your questions. Some of them were also part of the negotiation. Now, the one thing I would like to say is that while many countries talk in terms, they pretend to be or talk as proponents of free trade policy, of low tariffs and so on. In actual fact, there is a deviation from what they profess. You know the example of Japan, which has 700% tariff on rice. You know what happened in the agriculture negotiations. They said that the trade distorting subsidies will be cut, but in fact it increased manifold as a part of the negotiation. We see Australia, again a great proponent of free trade, but putting all kinds of non-tariff barriers. So, and we know what the US did. I mean, finally they finished off the WTO completely by keeping one of the appellate body members vacant, with the result that the dispute settlement mechanism completely disappeared. Once the dispute settlement mechanism went, after that, the WTO became totally toothless. So the effectiveness of the organization went. I mean, here is one place where I feel India should have played a more prominent role in pushing through whatever we had started in Doha and which we had continued in Geneva. I mean, there was a roadblock in Cancun, but after that, it had also been put in place in 2003 in Geneva. I think it would have been of advantage for us to make the multilateral system more effective, because that is better for us than very, very specific kind of agreements, which like regional trading arrangements. Now, one point I would like to make is that India is very different from other countries. India is different because we have a huge domestic market. We have a huge domestic economy, which is growing. What they say is it is growing I've read many papers saying that it's growing faster than the rest of the world, the fastest in the world. If that is so, we are going to create enough market within ourselves. And to a great extent, our economy has also been resilient. Whatever has been the economic policy of the government, our industry, particularly our unorganized sector, our medium, small industries, they have found ways of not being blocked by the global changes, the geopolitical changes, finding new ways. If the pandemic struck us, we had a new industry going in masks and sanitizers. So that kind of change, and we found a whole lot of domestic trade developing on the internet. So that kind of change India is good at, and India has been doing. So when we enter into a trading arrangement, whether it be a free trade arrangement or a preferential trade arrangement, we have to be very careful to see that we are looking at the overall interests of our economy. That is particularly important. It's not that we get wedded to a principle, but we look at what the country needs at that point of time. Having said that, I don't know much about the Eastern Bloc. It's the East Asian countries are no comparison to India really, because India has the domestic market. The East Asian countries, if you have an industry there, they have to export. There's no other way. They don't have enough of a domestic market to absorb the production there. So it's not really the same. So we need to fully leverage our negotiating strength and our ability to bargain using our own market. That's the way in which I think we should be going forward in these negotiations. But at the same time, I do believe that we need to relook at the old concepts of South Asian free trade area and South Asian preferential trade area, which was on the anvil for a long time, that has now disappeared. Then while we are negotiating on each issue, we need to be particularly conscious of what the needs of our own economy are. Now, I also believe there has to be a process of consultation and discussion within the country. Now, today I read an article by one Prabhash Ranjan of the Jindal University. He had described in detail the process followed by the UK in before they enter any free trade agreement. They first place a white paper before the public. Stakeholders are consulted. Then there is a parliamentary committee that sits on the free trade agreement. They have to prove that it is economically beneficial to us. I think that kind of consultation, because I recall when I first joined as joint secretary in the trade policy division of Commerce Ministry, one of the things I had to handle was a case filed by Jayalalitha against the agreement on agriculture, saying that agriculture is a state subject. How do you negotiate on that? So that was, I mean, the level of consultation has to be much greater in India. Now, so far as social factors are concerned, you see, basically the social things like labor, environment, etc., they have been factors used by certain countries to gain an advantage in their trade negotiations. That is how we have perceived it, and that is how we have dealt with it. Now that we have gone from the multilateral forum to the regional forum, to the regional agreements, now that is again becoming prominent. India has also gone a long way, and we can also probably negotiate a lot better on these areas. But it can be, we have to be very careful about what the intention behind these social factors are. The other point, what was the second point which you mentioned, a public body? I do feel a consultation is required. I think trade policy is in the present circumstances, trade policy should not only be limited to foreign trade, it should also encompass domestic trade. We should look at the totality of trade, and the Commerce Ministry, or whatever it is, must look at the totality of trade and must create forums within the country which can discuss that. And you see, in every democratic system, there will be certain people who don't like it, certain people who like it. And you've got to find a way out of it. That's how democracy works. So that is important, certainly. And I think, at least it has been my experience, that industry in India is not sufficiently active. Industry is not active. I mean, I remember that when I was in Geneva, every week I used to get a delegation from Japan, from the European Commission. At least once a month, the Americans would come. I had a great deal of difficulty in getting CII and FICCI to mount delegations to Geneva. The interest taken by industry has to be much greater in diplomacy. And I think we also need to develop our skills in diplomacy. I myself, I was considered to be a reasonably successful negotiator in Geneva as Indian ambassador to the WTO. But I myself felt that sometimes when I compare with with a Brazilian negotiator or with an American negotiator, I do not have all the skills. My skills lay more in sort of forming coalitions, winning friends and influencing people, which I learned from Kerala actually, because that's the only way in which you can manage business here. So I learned from Kerala. So I do believe that that is another area we need to look at. It's not just political diplomacy. We need to look at commercial diplomacy as a separate art, as a separate skill. And people have to work on it with both an outward-looking face as well as an inward-looking face. So these are some of the views I wanted to express.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shekhar. I'll come back to you later. May I now request Dheeraj Nayyar? Dheeraj, are you there?
Yes.
Dheeraj?
Yes, sir.
Hi. Hi, welcome.
Thanks. Thank you.
Have you read the question that I sent you?
You can ask it.
No. How prepared is the industry for decarbonization and for policies like the European Union's carbon border adjustment measure? What kind of policy is required to preserve and expand our export interests in rapidly decarbonizing export markets? By the way, I've been talking about this to Leena Nandan, the Environmental Secretary, and she's very au fait with this particular issue and wants to see as to how she can make the steel making industry much more environmentally friendly than it is. Over to you.
Yeah, no, I think
3 to 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'll take less than that. Just a general point to start with. But I think sometimes the problem is that we look at trade policy in isolation, and what is the purpose of trade policy? One way to look at it is to increase exports, obviously, because as Mr. Ahluwalia said, we know that those are an engine of growth. But I think in the larger political economy context, what is the pressure that stakeholders face or the government faces its jobs or good jobs? And I think ultimately you're only going to get those through manufacturing, because you still have 40-45% of your workforce in agriculture. They're not coming into services. So where are they going to go? So that whole good jobs problem is again intricately linked. And whereas the Indian market is large, the global merchandise market is much larger. It's about 18 or 19 trillion dollars. India's GDP is only 3 trillion. So certainly we should be looking at the world. But I think the fundamental problem is our own competitiveness. And to one extent, you can say firms are not competitive and they lobby and they do rent seeking on tariffs, which there may be some truth to that. But I think the policy induced uncompetitiveness, which I think Mr. Gopal Agarwal referred to, in terms of the issues on land. How do you compete with China? You reduce your tariff to zero, I can still bet you will not get global value chains here, because the myriad of approvals required, the time it takes, for environment, forest approval, the average currently is 900 days. 900 days. When the government's target is 120. Who's going to come and set up a large industry if that's what it's going to take, even if your tariffs are zero? Not that I'm saying that it's a reason to raise tariffs or be protectionist, but ultimately, it's not going to serve your purpose until you, solve these domestic, cost issues, cost competitiveness issues, whether it's approvals, whether it's land, whether it's labor, whether it's power tariffs, as Mr. Gopal Agarwal correctly said, whether it's freight charges. All of these render you, uncompetitive, particularly vis-a-vis China, where the opposite kind of support is given. The huge subsidies are given. Now, in terms of intervention, I think PLI or the capital subsidy they're giving for electronics is probably more productive and performance-based than tariffs. So I would prefer if an intervention is made. I think those are more productive interventions than just raising tariffs one way. I'm sure there are different views on this, but I think ultimately, unless you're a cost-competitive economy domestically, in terms of your policy environment, in terms of how your firms operate, even in our MSMEs, most firms are micro, not even small or medium, right? And they're never going to again be part of regional or global value chains. And the policy, again, historically has favored firms remaining small rather than becoming large. PLI is actually the first policy which incentivizes firms to become larger than they are. So I think given these our domestic policy environment, a lot of it is legacy, admittedly. Until you change that, I don't think trade policy per se is going to help you. So a zero tariff or low tariff policy will not create a competitive industry. We've seen that, over 25 years, since 91% of manufacturing GDPs remain the same. Similarly, you raise tariffs, that's not going to create a competitive industry either. It'll probably create some kind of industry like, pre-91, which is, you may have manufacturing here, but it will not be globally competitive. So I think we need to look at it, as you said, Mr. Mehta, at the start, to trade and industrial policy together. Is what
I'm on a Zoom
I should
call.
think, because unless there's that domestic competitiveness created for manufacturing, you're not going to be able to compete. I mean, free trade area, no free trade area, value chains are not. You look at, I wrote an article the day before on electric vehicles. So much talk about it in India, so much hype. You look at the global value chain, we are zilch. We are not there at any point in the value chain. So, and that's similar with a lot of, value chains. They just aren't here. And they're not going to come simply, at least as far as I'm concerned, by simply reducing tariffs. Not enough. On your point on decarbonization, I think, again, now, how do you look at it? This can be looked at as a protectionist measure by the advanced economies, given their own legacy and history and contributing to the carbon problem. It's rather rich for them to impose standards on emerging economies. But I think, again, there will be no choice. I think firms are already looking at, particularly firms which consume a lot of fossil fuel, already looking at alternatives, switching to a certain amount of renewable energy and various other moves. But I mean, ultimately, we don't still have a solution, a competitive solution for heavy industry in terms of a non-fossil fuel substitute for now. We can certainly blend, but to rule out fossil fuel altogether is not going to happen in the next 5 or 6 years. It's going to take at least 10 years. So I think, again, if developed countries wish to use this as a protection mechanism for protecting their own, particularly say in metals, which I know, they are not competitive. And a lot of them, in fact, have closed down aluminium, steel, etc. in Europe because of the high energy prices. So if they're going to use this as a method to prop up their own industries as a method of industrial policy, then again, I don't know. That doesn't say much for their commitment to free trade either. So I think I'll stop there, but I do urge you, whenever you do the summary for this, that industrial policy and trade, and industrial policy, I don't necessarily mean more and more subsidies. I mean, there's a limit to that. But in terms of the policy reforms that are required, in which the government, I mean, at the highest level says they will do, but I think the bureaucracy at the various levels, state, local, and so on, makes it very, very difficult. And that escalates the cost of doing business hugely. I think the government is aware of it. I'm not saying they're not, but as Mr. Agarwal said, it takes a while to sort out, some of these issues because of how long they've been vested in them.
Thank you. Dheeraj, we've done, as I said.
Hi, Pradeep, can I just intervene for just on 2 points for 1 minute, because then I have to leave? Is that okay?
Fine. Gopalji also wanted 1 minute. So go ahead, please.
Well, yeah, just 2 points that I wanted to intervene on. One, I think it was KM who made the point that India is very different from East Asia because we have a large domestic market. Of course, we have a large domestic market, but if you take East Asia together, the combined GDP of the East ASEAN countries is approximately $3.6 trillion. It's actually larger than our GDP. So clearly, from their point of view, they're solving that problem through internal free trade, just as we have internal free trade. But even with a $3.6 trillion internal economy, they've actually gone to integrate with others around the world. So the argument that India has a large market, I don't think it's fair to say that therefore we don't have to worry about these things. I don't think that follows. Second, I think the point that Dheeraj made, which is right, that there are lots of higher costs that Indian industries have to experience, which is due to all kinds of domestic distortions. I mean, we want to subsidize farmers and retail households, therefore we overcharge industry. It's the wrong thing to do. But see, I think to respond to that by raising tariffs is not the right thing, because what you're then doing is you're helping the import substituting industries, but making it worse for the exporters. So quite frankly, if there are external impediments which we're trying to resolve, but may take some time before they're finally resolved, frankly, the only way of offsetting them in a non-distortionary manner is to have an undervalued exchange rate. I mean, the Chinese for years ran a very undervalued exchange rate, which was an underpinning of a lot of their growth. Too often industry says, as long as these problems are there, we can't lower tariffs. But what they're really saying is, because these problems are there, import substituting industry must be protected and export industry can suffer. So I think that aspect, the discriminatory nature of the tariff response to high domestic costs needs to be kept in mind. Thanks. I'm sorry to have pitched
Montek,
in
I
on
hope
this.
you can stay unless there is some.
Well, I'm staying for a little while. I'll
Okay,
hear
fine.
Gopal and then.
Gopalji has to go for an urgent meeting and he wants to speak for about 30 seconds. Gopalji, can I ask you one question before you respond?
Yeah,
I think nobody has spoken about the fact that a lot of this effort has to be done through coordination with our states. And we cannot do everything in the central government alone. Though trade policy, of course, is a central government sort of terrain, yet the states have to implement a lot of it. Over to you.
Thank you. That's an important point that you underline. And the state's major role is land is one of the big challenge that even Dheeraj ji also said, and is a availability of land and land cost, which cannot come without the state's cooperation and which can, without which the industries cannot come and develop. So that's one thing. I would just, for 30 seconds, I would say some of the points underline them, that there is a big opportunity at present for India to grow, see growth in the economy, but that will come only when we integrate with a global supply chain and regional values chain. There is no doubt on it. The thing is, when sequencing of the thing is, when and how, very important question, and that requires more deliberation. Whether domestic, the challenges like integrating the domestic value chain, because industry is facing a lot of problems which will be done through, as Pradeep ji said, by Gati Shakti or industrial policy, whatever way it is done, but the efficiency in the domestic supply chain is one of the precursor for that. And the second is, I think is important is building capacity on the international laws. That's very important if we go for international trade treaties and integration. We have that deficiency. And the third point that I would like, that the issue at whether recently OECD or other trade agreement is that ESG compliance will become a big challenge for our manufacturing thing. And I have seen, because I am also finance professional, so I've seen that the balance sheets are not reflecting about the carbon or ESG compliance, and that will become a big bottleneck for our industries, like it had been for phytosanitary standards, etc. The same thing will be used by international companies, international countries for the thing. So and ESG compliance capability has to be built. Then international law capacity, dealing with international law is very important, and strengthening domestic value supply chain. If this is the initial way, then we can easily achieve the goal. Thank you.
Well, Gopalji, before you go, I think you made a very important point in terms of capacity building on dealing with laws. There's no doubt about that. But what Ajit Ranade had said is something which you, as a China watcher, should remember, that China is a $6 trillion consumer market. Number one. Number two is our bilateral trade with China is growing. Are we going to be afraid of China, or are we going to use that opportunity in a way that we can help our own industry? As I said, I mean, people are saying, look east. Honorable Prime Minister is talking about Act East. So when you're saying Act East, why do you ignore China?
No, the thing is that
Secondly, no, one more thing, Gopalji, very importantly, what people are not understanding is that if in case we have to promote multilateralism as is been a professed policy of the government of India, China is an inevitable imperative. You cannot ignore China, whether it is climate change or whatever else we do. Over to you.
no, we cannot ignore. I agree. Therefore, with all the restrictions or whatever the government policies or discussions are, our trade with China is not reducing. So we cannot ignore China. We understand, but what the government thinks is that Chinese challenge is giving so many opportunities for our economy, because surely global companies are looking for risk diversion strategy, and that is the main benefit that India can have. Second is the Chinese have at present situation have no alternative but to what the global thought discussion is, that they have to slow down their economic growth due to certain compulsions domestically. So that is also an opportunity. So what we see as China as a challenge, we see that it's an opportunity for us to grow
Exactly.
Southeast Asian countries, and we should work on that. Challenges is not that we are disintegrating with China on economic issues, but we should look into the opportunities.
Thank you. Dheeraj, 30 seconds.
One second. One second.
Sorry, please.
Montek Singh ji said, and you talked about multilateral thing. I agree with Mr. Ahluwalia that multilateral treaties have reached a zero outcome at present. They are not helping any country.
No, Pradeep ji, I just wanted to say one thing in response to what Mr. Ahluwalia said. I mean, I agree with him that raising tariffs is not the greatest response and discriminates against exporters. Just the one interesting thing, Mr. Vadhavan is here. I saw Mr. Ramupendra Das also here. So I attended a lot of the consultations that happened on RCEP. And in not one, I can take industry consultations, manufacturing consultations, and in not one did any industry player, exporter or importer, anybody favor signing RCEP. Mr. Vadhavan can correct me if I'm wrong, but even that was what the minister, Mr. Goyal, also said, that there is absolutely nobody or at least nobody significant who's saying that this is a good thing. So if there are exporters who are interested, or if there is Indian industry that is interested in RCEP and promoting free trade areas, then they must stand up and be counted, because the political economy is such that the government will also respond to how the various stakeholders respond.
If I can just respond to that, you see, when they come to a consultation as a domestic manufacturer, they want protection, and at the same time they want access to foreign markets. So your industry has a stock reply that it is too sensitive for the tariff to be liberalized for us, but we want access there, not realizing that unless you give access here, you won't get access there. So that is the standard situation with all the FTAs we've signed. Industry universally from A to Z will say, sorry, don't lower our tariff, it is too sensitive, but we want access there. So that's the story.
Anup, that's a major story which we keep on hearing again and again, and for some very valid reasons, and I think that requires a very separate slogan discussions. Just a slogan that don't lower tariffs or don't enter into FTAs. Manish has a 30-second comment to make. Manish.
No, I just wanted to come in briefly. This entire discussion around engaging China, which is all very good. But the fact is that we've seen a paradigm where we thought that an economic engagement would actually lead to a resolution of the political issues that kind of conflict the relationship, not only China, but even Pakistan. Unfortunately, that has not happened. And so therefore, till the time we do not find a political modus vivendi vis-a-vis both Pakistan and China, I do not see a movement on either the South Asian free trade area, which Mr. Chandrasekhar talked about, or even with regard to China. So therefore, we are not Taiwan, whereby Taiwan remains threatened, but there are 482 flights daily between Taipei and the Chinese mainland. I think we are in a different bucket altogether. And so therefore, if we are to ignore that reality, and if I'm permitted the use of this word, indulge in wishful thinking, I don't think that substitutes for trade policy. I'm sorry if that sounded a little harsh, but I just thought I'll put it out there.
Thank you very much. May I now request Shumanto Chaudhary? Shumanto, are you there? Shumanto Chaudhary? Seems you've gone. May I request Ajay Kumar Srivastava? Ajay?
Yes. Good
Ajay, are
evening,
you there?
everyone.
Right.
I will take just 2 minutes and talk about only one issue, tariffs. As Montek sir has said, the noise created by FTAs, we forget that 80% of the world trade takes place at the MFN duties. It's 80% trade is non-preferential. Here, there is very little discussion on how to promote trade. Focusing on competitiveness and all those things. But I want to focus only on one factor, tariff. Simplest of the products like textiles, from textiles to electronics, we use imported components, imported imports. And if duties are high, the cost becomes higher. So domestically, we are raised by imports and exports becomes uncompetitive. So if I say one problem, one issue where we have to focus as trade policy tool for promoting our exports is tariffs. 50% of the world trade happens at MFN zero duty. 60% of intra two countries trade takes place at MFN zero duty. 70% of ASEAN world trade takes place at MFN zero duty. Our duties, we are raising them. We need a big debate on lowering down the duty. So I'm very convinced if you want to talk about trillions of dollars of exports, you can't do. We lower the duty.
We've agreed to have a separate debate on this.
Thank you very much. I have nothing more to say.
Ajay, we'll have a separate debate on this.
Thank you very much.
Very, very pointed debate. And now, may I request Raju Kanodia? What are the priority policy measures required for better integration of MSMEs into the manufacturing and build export linkages? And how can we strategically protect industry interests without resorting to measures like anti-dumping and countervailing duties that ratchet up input costs for MSMEs?
I have listened to the debate, very interesting, and I have already reacted a little bit to what Montek has said. And I think I'll just like to go back to 1991. I think some of the fear that we are expressing today about the type of reforms which are required to make ourselves competitive were taken care of at that time through both lowering of tariffs as well as correcting the exchange rate. And I think the exchange rate point which Montek has made is a very, very important point, because I don't think that we can solve the problems of manufacturing in terms of competitiveness so easily. There was some talk saying that there is a desire to correct these, but the bureaucracy is not allowing this to happen. I kind of disagree with that, because I think many of these problems are political in nature. I mean, if you look at cross-subsidization of power tariffs, if you look at cross-subsidization of interest rates, if you look at the preferential rates which are given for priority industries or so on, if you look at many of these, I think they are off balance sheets. They are just not in the government balance sheet. They come onto the private sector's balance sheet. And they are being used as tools for the so these are very, very difficult decisions. They will have a political outfall, whether it be the entire question of subsidies, whether we look at fertilizer or any other aspect. I mean, they are all political in nature, and they will require some lot of political will to happen. I think in the process of change, we have also been making some mistakes, because we have pushed through some of the changes without the consultation process which has been talked about. And that has also actually made many of these reforms even more difficult than they would normally have been had they gone through the process of consultation. So if we talk about industry's competitiveness and how to integrate MSMEs into the value chains, I think one of the fundamentals which needs to be recognized is that we need to have an environment which allows the MSMEs to participate in the competitive environment of world trade. The second point I want to take up, and this has also been discussed quite a lot, is that we are not an integral part of the supply chains because we have chosen to remain away from the large agreements which dominate global trade. I mean, if we look at the Indo-Pacific Economic Cooperation, we have chosen not to be part of the trade pillar. Out of the 4 pillars of that agreement, we have chosen not to be part of the trade pillar. And 40% of global trade, these 14 countries are accounting for. So I think that as a conscious decision, and I think there was some point which was also made that unless there is a political will, I think Manish ji made that point. I think the point is that with Pakistan or with China, I think the projection which is there today in the psychological environment of the populace is that we do not wish to engage with China. And therefore, the entire rhetoric which is driving our relationship and our economic thinking is driven on political, on what is being portrayed politically. And that's the fear of China in terms of its military prowess or its incursion into the borders. So constantly we are battling this idea. And I think Ajit made a very important point that why are we ignoring the $6 trillion consumer market? So unless and until we are part of the RCEP, there is no way that we can integrate ourselves with China. I mean, the Chinese-led multilateral or plurilateral platform is RCEP. And if we want to take advantage of the China Plus policy, I think we should be looking at China Plus for supplying to China also.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raghu. My job is very difficult actually. There are nine speakers still on the list. So I'm going to cut you short with a request to please conclude.
Yeah, I will conclude. I've talked about.
No,
I want to
if there
talk
is an
about
opportunity, I'll come back to you at the end.
I want one very important point which I want to make, which is the PLI scheme. The PLI scheme, I believe, is directed.
There are 2 people speaking on PLI.
No, I think it's a large industry which is benefiting from it, and a lot of the medium scale is being cannibalized because in terms of production linked incentive, many people, because let us take refrigerators. Refrigerator demand will not go up by 20%, but you'll start producing panels, etc., which other people are producing. Anyway,
Anyway, thank you very much, Raju. With that, may I request Anil Bhardwaj from the Secretary General of ISME. Anil, and as it happens, whenever you're towards the end, your time gets shorter. My very strong sort of apologies for that. Anil, 3 minutes.
Okay. You have a question?
Yeah, I sent you a question.
Okay.
How can MSMEs tackle the proliferation of trade restrictive SPS and TBT measures?
All right. See, the context is the kind of FTAs that we are signing now, especially with Australia, UK, and European Union. They definitely look very promising from the point of view of expansion of access to markets. But the promise to provide, they of course promise to provide Indian SMEs more even playing field, because we are competing with South Asian countries and they have access, they have advantage of GSP and we do not have advantage of GSP. And GSP is a very important factor when we are talking about textile and garments, handicrafts, gems and jewelry, leather, all these products where MSMEs are concentrated. So in this context, there are few issues that need to be considered, particularly with regard to SPS and TBT. Both in terms of our regulatory quality and institutional capacity, I think we need to really work on war footing. Whether it is harmonization of standards, mutually MRAs, and with the labs. Industry itself is not sensitized enough. And without preparing the country, the market access promise actually will prove hollow. So even if they will open their markets for us, MSMEs would not be able to realize the potential unless we work very hard on SPS and TBT. Then there are issues of concern with regard to public procurement. As you know that MSMEs had 25% set aside in Indian central government purchases. I mean, are we going to open public procurement? Are we negotiating that? Of course, this is on table in certain negotiations. And also trade plus issues like labor issues. So how far we would like to go, that's important without really doing the corresponding reforms in the domestic market.
Thank
The
you very
biggest
much.
the last point is that, the bigger, and Mr. Nair touched upon it, that, without having the capacity and capability of Indian firms, see, most of the exports currently are being done by MSMEs, which have suboptimal capacity, both in terms of size as well as technical capability. I think we need to really see that our focus shifts from, as so far as exports is concerned, from micro and small to medium-sized enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I request Anup? Anup, what happened? Anup, the question to you is, how has the proposed restructuring of the Commerce Ministry helped in improving trade policy making?
Well, I was prepared for something totally different.
No, I sent you this question.
I maybe not.
My only request to all the panelists now is, and I'm sorry to have not said it earlier, I've tried to request people not to repeat things which have been said and to add a new dimension.
Yeah. So let me, in a nutshell say that, to the extent we have not achieved our potential as a trading nation and as a manufacturing nation, we are way below our potential if you compare us with, other economies in similar situations. Certainly, we need to look at these issues of trade policy and industrial policy in a new manner. And one underlying prescription, which again is widely accepted with certain provisos, is that you need more openness and you need a certain degree of trade liberalization. And I also believe that these are essential prerequisites. They are necessary conditions, but not sufficient conditions. As Dheeraj said, you can bring all your duties to zero and you still might not have investment.
Yeah.
The necessary condition is competitiveness. You have to become a competitive economy. But I think a prerequisite for competitiveness is to be an open economy. As I think Mr. Kanoria mentioned, competitiveness requires, competitiveness of cost. And if you're not an open economy, you're not going to be able to import the best inputs in the world at the most competitive prices. Openness is a prerequisite for competitiveness, which is the ultimate goal. And for being a successful economy, whether as a trading nation or as a manufacturing nation, you need that competitiveness. And, and of course, we are talking about global value chains, and they are being seen now as a panacea for your problems. It is being seen as something which you can just opt for without doing anything else, and all your problems will go away. You see, to the extent you could not perform, then value chains were consolidated. If you don't do things differently, you will not perform, even with the GVCs being there.
Anup, my very specific question to you is that there is now a change from the times that you were running the Commerce Ministry to what has now been proposed in this very beautiful new temple which I have been to. Today, for the first time, the Vanijya Bhavan is such a grand palace.
Yeah, no, that is not really a part of the essential change which has happened. That palace,
I know.
That building was being constructed for a long time, and the idea was to consolidate all the Commerce Ministry offices in one place. So, and I don't think it will be very prudent on my part to speak too candidly on this subject. But, at a broad level, you need capacity. I think a lot of speakers have mentioned that you need capacity, you need preparedness for being, part of global trade in terms of, being part of negotiations, in terms of protecting your interests and maximizing the opportunities that, global engagements afford. So I see, whatever change that we might endeavor to do, in the structure of a department or in other things that a department does. The underlying objective should be, improving your capacity to perform the various functions. So I'm not sure, and to look at that, you need to distinguish between form and substance. To what extent it is form, to what extent it is substance, I will not go into that issue. But I think we need to go into that issue that, what are the substantive changes and reforms and restructuring you need, and whether, whatever we endeavor to do meets that threshold of substantiveness, or is it, just going to end up as change of form without much impact. But I haven't, to be honest, gone into this issue carefully enough. But that is all I will say on this. Let me, say one final thought, since we are short of time and I'm not able to follow my script. This whole thing about, the Indian market being big. One, of course, if you adjust the Indian market for per capita incomes, the market is not that big. And, in a globalized world, you look at, say, from the perspective of Vietnam, from the perspective of an investor, which is the bigger market, Vietnam or India? If you invest in Vietnam, you export to EU duty-free. You export to the entire ASEAN duty-free. You're part of RCEP, you export to China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand duty-free. You're part of PPP. You export to almost much of the world duty-free. So from the point of view of an investor, is India a bigger market or is Vietnam a bigger market? So we need to keep all these things in mind. And someone spoke about self-confidence. How come Vietnam has the self-confidence to say that I will abide by a 99% trade liberalization, 99% of my duty is going to zero. I'll abide by the most advanced rules, whether it is environment, labor, e-commerce. I will abide by those rules and I'll come up better than my rival. How come they have that confidence? So the ultimate thing is how confident and capable you are to be competitive. And openness in some ways has nothing to do with it. It has something to do with it in the sense that you will never have the incentive to be competitive unless you're open. And at the same time, being open will not prevent you from being competitive. And I think we should learn from Vietnam. And we can't look at these trade agreements in isolation, that, the trade deficit went up in the ASEAN FTA. Look at the macro picture. Look at pre-1991, look at today. We had the 1991 reforms, which is the biggest FTA we could have signed. Our biggest FTA till date was the 1991 reform. Then we signed many other FTAs. I think no one in his right mind can say that we are worse off today than we were in 1991. We are a much stronger economy. So we need to look at these things in perspective. One final thought. This whole discussion is dominated, trade creates winners and losers. And the discussion gets dominated by the losers. We have to take care of the losers. We have to transition them to the new world. But the losers, dominate the trade discussion, and the winners really don't have a say. So that is all I'll say. I'm sorry for the somewhat staccato and haphazard.
No. I think all the points which you made are all very valid, and we're going to make a note of that and come back. May I request Lakshmi Puri? Lakshmi, what is the most important priority area that should be pursued by Indian missions abroad to expand trade and investment linkages with their host countries?
Thank you. I would very much like to pick up some of the points that have been made before on reform, on capacity, on how we need to reinvent ourselves in so many different ways. But let me begin by saying that the priorities for our missions are dictated by some of the factors that have been mentioned by previous speakers. But let me begin with the geopolitical divide and Cold War 2.0, with the economy, trade, technology being the main battlefields of strategic and tactical competition at the least, and even conflict, if you look at US-China, West-Russia. And the question is, how is our foreign policy, foreign economic policy, trade policy, how are we able to save ourselves from the crossfire and profit from it? So that's the first context in which the foreign missions have to operate. The second is the number of upheavals in the world economy in the last 3 years, post-COVID world, and now the Russia-Ukraine war related economic challenges from recessionary trends, inflation, financial crisis, exchange rate fluctuations, fuel, food and fertilizer, and supply chain disruptions. So how to overcome them? So even as we talk about our participation in the global supply chains, but there is this whole issue of having to overcome some of these challenges. The other one is that, as you've all spoken about value chains, global value chains, but and about the fact that there is a big opportunity in the way that there is rethink about particularly amongst Western global investors and multinationals about relocating from China as part of decoupling or at least reducing dependence on China. So, and also the other, because of energy issues, locating to sell as much as locating because of competitiveness issues of labor or whatever other competitiveness issues that have been mentioned. And then, of course, there is this, what is the Prime Minister's vision and what is the instruction to our missions. Atmanirbharta is the key, but and we have to work as one government, as one, that's why all of government, all of MEA, because I think there is that one, the all of MEA approach, the all of government, that is interministerial coordination approach, and also from headquarters to the missions approach, because all of that needs to be fixed in a different way in order to really deliver on the ambition. And then I come to the ambition of our becoming part of global and regional value chains. And I think there is no doubt that Prime Minister himself has said, there are many others who have policymakers, including the Commerce Minister, has said that we are very keen to support global and regional value chain participation by India. And it's an imperative. And particularly in key sectors, and also the other aspect, the other objective is access to key resources, energy, food, minerals, rare earths, and intermediaries, as we discovered during COVID, intermediaries like APIs in priority. And then we've talked about the international trading system. WTO is slowly recovering from its past paralysis. But in the meanwhile, as we have seen, a proliferation of plurilateral, minilateral, regional and interregional FTAs and economic cooperation groupings. So how do we use this as a means of determining the rules of the game? And I heard very carefully the debate on RCEP, market access, plus investment incentives and global value chain decisions. So this is also something that our missions must pick up the signal, but I'm going to come to exact what are they supposed to do in order to pursue these priorities. Environment and climate change.
With 1,000 apologies, Lakshmi, could you take 1 minute?
Very quickly.
Thank you very much.
Economy considerations coming into play. And then you have spoken about the 5 trillion economy target, the 10 trillion, and trade and investment has to play a very important role because it accounts for half of it. And we have to have at least $100 billion per year of investment. Now you look at all these, and then you come to what must the missions do. Being an information hub on a whole range of India's economic, manufacturing, services, agriculture, productive capacities, trade, finance, investment, technology, energy, landscape, and potential, and how it is transforming itself. You've talked about the, still we have some way to go, but we have been transforming. And how, and the granular and the general, the targeted and the general, and then also how, what are the businesses in the country of accreditation? Conversely, educating the headquarters and acting as a think tank for relevant ministries, agencies, and Indian players. And I want to emphasize that Indian players about, and national champions, I want to use that term, I know no longer very popular, but about the policies and landscape and potential of countries they are accredited to, and what are the complementarities, what are the opportunities, what are the competitiveness or competition related issues. And then of course, network, outreach, matchmaking, facilitation of both sides. And I think there is this particular emphasis on the 3 T's, the trade, tourism, technology that Prime Minister Modi has put forward. And the missions are being asked increasingly to take on technology diplomacy, and particularly in the areas of securing partnerships in Tech 4.0 area. And also, of course, investment promotion. I want to just say one last thing, and perhaps we'll come back to that, the issue of capacities. Do we have the training? Do we have the manpower? Do we have the capacities to really do all of this in our missions? Is something that, and to what extent they are connecting with the Commerce Ministry, connecting with MEA, how it is all being coordinated. Since you are going to give recommendations on that, it's very important that aspect.
This has been said before many times.
And dedicated personnel in our missions have to be put in place, and they must have the capacity, they must have all the backing, and of course partnership with the private sector, multi-stakeholder engagement, all of that.
Thank you very much. We've just got 14 minutes and about 7 speakers. So over to you, Rajat.
Hi, can you hear me, Pradeep?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, thank you. I'm not going to.
The question I had asked you was,
I know.
One issue, one word which has come up throughout this discussion. Many people have spoken about competitiveness issues. Would you like to focus on that?
Sure.
In terms of what policy prescription can you offer in the trade policy context?
Okay, so I'm also going to focus, I'm going to take this discussion in terms of jobs, because you asked me about labor-intensive manufacturing sectors. So how do you become competitive in labor-intensive manufacturing?
If you can do it in 3 to 4 minutes?
I will, and I won't take
more
than 3 minutes, but I won't back up what I say by evidence, but believe me, there is evidence. Whatever I'm saying is based on some research that has been done in some institutions. So I think the approach to competitiveness in India, or lack of it, has been so far since 1991. Once we reformed, the approach has been really, if I have a disability, and Harsh is sitting here and he's done a lot of work on disabilities in electronics. So if I have a disability, how do you get around it? Well, the government says, okay, I will cure your disability by creating some disability for others. Right. So if you are not competitive, then I will create a market for you by creating a disability for others. I think this has gone on for too long, and this needs to change. And every speaker has spoken about this, that you need to sort of get away from tariffs, get away from trying to impose restrictions, licensing forms, so that we are now operating in an open economy. And the reason I say this is because this is this is something that affects the competitiveness of manufacturing. Therefore, zero tariffs or low tariffs is something that we should move towards. There's no question, to make our industry competitive. And the other thing that stifles our industry is size. So tariffs and size, we have to grow big. And if we grow big, we will not compromise the manufacturing sector, the small and medium enterprise. I think we will create firms that will take on the small and medium enterprises as well, along with them. The example of Maruti as the lead firm, as it were, and created these ancillary industries, which themselves have become competitive in the global economy. So size and getting rid of restrictions, I think, is the two recommendations. Services will not sort of answer it for us. We have to go the manufacturing route, whether you want to call it manufacturing or manufacturing and services or servicification of manufacturing. But at the end of the day, India needs manufacturing just like the other countries before us needed manufacturing for their takeoff. So I think this is one point. The second point, Pradeep, is that why have we done well in electronics relatively to other industries is because the gross value to volume ratio has been very high for components and electronics. So, which means you've in some ways been able to bypass the transactions cost imposed by our very bad and poor logistics infrastructure. So the success of electronics is despite the poor the logistics sector, not because of it. So we need to improve logistics and get rid of almost all the disabilities we have, but we can't do it for every industry. You can't let industry choose, create good infrastructure, and therefore whoever is good will come in. What T.N. Srinivasan used to say in his career, that don't pick national champions. But I think when you're talking about industrial policy and trade policy, I think we'll have to pick industry, and we've already picked. So I think there's no gainsaying the fact. I think most of the industries that have picked themselves are electronics and some textiles, etc. So I think that's, in a sense, the way to go. Two more points very quickly. One,
Rajat, can you send it in writing? I will put it up in the question.
This is an important point which hasn't been made by anybody. I think Mr. Chandrasekhar.
One. Yes, okay. Please. Thank you.
One point. This is made by Mr. Chandrasekhar. I think the fact that we shy away from negotiations for whatever reason, like ITA, we don't want to participate, commerce, we don't want to participate. By all means, don't do what the West is asking you to do, or don't do what we are being asked to do. But for heaven's sake, at least participate. So that, why be diffident? We have, a lot of capacity. We have lots of skills. We can negotiate. We should negotiate, even if we want to refuse to follow what plurilaterals are doing, but we should be in the room rather than outside the room, and we should fight the system from within the room, I think. And that's an important point, I think, that Mr. Chandrasekhar made. Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you very much. May I request Veena Jha? In what areas are the existing domestic policies restricting export growth, and how can they be remedied?
Yeah, there are four areas. The first is regulatory issues. The second is tariffs, which was already spoken about, so I won't go into that area. The third is related to the logistics, which again is something that we need to look at. And the fourth is actually lack of implementation of policies which have already been discussed, like the PLI, for example. Only one sector has been able to avail of PLI, and that's the electronic sector. And the reason why they have been able to do it is because they were prepared before the PLI to make that kind of investment. So these are the four important policies, but I'd like to throw some more light on some of these, especially on depreciation, which has been spoken about, and the tariff policy. What is very interesting is, and I wish Mr. Ahluwalia was here, is that depreciation actually mitigates, our tariff policy actually mitigates the effect of depreciation. We did a comparison between China and India, and China's tariffs were very low, but its depreciation has been higher than, currency depreciation has been higher than India's, but still the effect of the tariff policy has mitigated that depreciation. And this is a very interesting point because depreciation is inevitable for developing countries like India because of the trade deficit that we incur. So we have to see the balancing effects of tariffs and depreciation. The second point I wanted to make is that it's often been spoken about that India is a large market. If you look at only the electronic sector, India is only 3% of the global market. Now, that's a very, very small market because we have to talk of effective markets. We can't be talking ad infinitum of our 300 million middle class, etc., because the effective buying power of the 300 million middle class, it cannot be compensated by not exporting. So basically, export pessimism is not the answer. Import substitution is not the answer. Domestic policy has to be oriented towards export growth. I'll stop there, Pradeep.
Thank you very much, Veena. That's very kind of you to have made your very important points in a very succinct and a pointed manner. May I now request Harsh?
Thank you.
What
Thank you,
policy
Pradeep.
measures are needed to fully capitalize on India's domestic market as a basis for better integration with global value chains?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very
We
much,
all heard
Pradeep.
about the excellent work you've already done. So
thank you.
How can
Thank
you put it in a very succinct and a summary form?
I'll try. And you know, a lot of speakers have talked about global value chains. When you are trying to connect with, and there is aspiration to connect with global value chains, what you need to be aware of is the key characteristics of a global value chain. I'll just talk about that in a few seconds, and the fact that policies which you have to implement in order to enable that participation. So when you are trying to connect with global value chains, your policy approach must be that of a value chain or a supply chain. Policy is implemented by individual ministries or departments, etc. There must be a supply chain wide policy consideration and coordination. That's something very important. What are the key parts of global value chain? A lead firm, you have talked about lead firm. Rajat talked about Maruti as a lead firm in automobiles. So a lead firm drives the value chain. Then the contract suppliers provide all the inputs which go into a value chain. And they are located in multiple countries. A global value chain, by definition, involves a product crossing at least 2 international borders, which means that you must make it very, very quick for the product to be able to come to the processing facility, be processed and exported to another country. That is the minimum for a global value chain. A third part is, and all countries want to desire this, local firms must be connected to global value chains. But then how do we learn about connecting these local firms? Because we have talked about capacity. We must learn from the countries which have actually succeeded in achieving the objective we are trying to achieve. And we have talked about a lot of problems India faces. These countries face the same problems, and they've slowly overcome them. So if I look at only the problems, and if we have an import substitution approach, then you cannot really link up with a global market. You are only de-linking yourself with an approach of import substitution to your own market. And that is not a global value chain strategy. So the fourth aspect is that when you are talking about firms, which are vendors, contract suppliers, local firms, that's one aspect. There is an operational ecosystem where you have to have an approach towards policy. A government policy maker who is interested in promoting a global value chain is a partner in the process, not an overseer in the process. So how do you enable that partnership? How do you, and Veena talked about implementation. Often you announce good policies, but they are not implemented quickly or properly. The other thing is, if you change policies too frequently, that doesn't help the planning or business planning in global value chains. When you have to think, how is a firm planning its business? And Rajat talked about scale. Without scale, you cannot be a successful participant. You cannot have a successful global value chain within a country context. So all countries which are known for global value chain participation in a bigger way, they operate at scale. Be it Bangladesh for apparel, be it Vietnam for mobile phones, scale is important. And what is required for scale? Investment. When will investment happen? When there is a stable and predictable policy environment, when your business plans can be implemented. If you do not think and formulate policy along these lines, which enable these business plans to grow, you will not be a successful participant in the global value chain. So I'll stop now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Harsh. May I request Ram Upendra Das? Ram, are you there? Ram? May I request Preetam Banerjee? Are PLI scheme the right policies to incentivize domestic manufacturing?
Thank you very much, Pradeep ji. I will, try to quickly summarize the points. So the short answer is yes. I think at this point in time, it's a good policy. It's one of the important, tools to have in your toolbox for industrial policy for three reasons. Number one, the PLI essentially is targeting sectors where there is significant future growth opportunities for this country. And to be able to transit into those sectors, you need to bring in scale and you need to bring in technology. And this is precisely the kind of things that the PLI scheme incentivizes. We also know from detailed detailed analysis of industrial policy history in East Asia and other parts of the world that this similar kind of schemes were also implemented by the East Asian economies in the 80s and 90s. In fact, many such policies are still being executed by sub-regional governments in China, in EU, in US, and many other parts of the world to get big ticket, strategic sector investments into their economies. Last but not the least is the timing. In post-pandemic world, I think other speakers have also spoken about this. Many firms, lead firms in the global value chains are looking at a China plus strategy. They're looking at what they are calling friend shoring. So in this context, having this in your toolbox to get in the big ticket investments in strategic sectors is important. But I would say PLI, yes, with a nuance. And what are the three things we need to watch out for in the implementation and execution of the PLI scheme? Number one, and the most important one, I think, is that there should be credible commitment on the part of policymakers that these incentives and any tariff protection that has been considered in some of the cases are not infinite. They are time definite and they'll go after a few years. Because if there is any sense that further lobbying they will be able to extend these timelines, you will see underinvestment in competitiveness and the tendency to profiteer behind tariff walls and get benefits. So that's number one, credibility of the policy in terms of the finiteness of it. The second one, I think the design of PLI. So we have about 13 different sectoral schemes, and if I look across these 13 schemes, Pradeep ji, many of them lack a design. They have a design flaw, in my opinion, in the sense that they're not giving enough attention to product development, innovation, technology infusion, and skill development. And not enough attention has been given to that. And I think that some speakers have alluded to this. Designing this kind of, having this kind of key performance indicators which ensure that you have these objectives inbuilt into the scheme requires a monitoring mechanism for which I think our government believes it has less confidence it can implement that kind. It's not rocket science, but our own confidence in our ability of the Ministry of Commerce and other ministries to implement this kind of schemes, despite the wealth of data that we have today in the digital system, I think that diffidence is costing us. We need to relook into that. Last, most importantly, we should not have a sense of complacency that now that we have PLI, we have addressed the industrial policy aspect. PLI is a very small part of it. It's for big ticket strategic sector investments. We still have a lot of hard work to do for reforming our entire industrial policy to meet our trade policy obligations. And some of the key things, some of the key hard work elements that we need to do. Number one, easing access to the cost of credit, especially for short-term credit. It's a big challenge in India, and it's a killer when you are looking at margins and competition in the global economy. Second, we have still got a long way to go for developing genuine plug-and-play industrial zones. That is a big missing element which needs to come in. The third, addressing the procedural complexity of existing schemes. Take, for example, the duty drawback scheme in India. Has been there for decades, but you will see many other countries, even Bangladesh, executing this much more efficiently than we do. And it adds real costs. Number three, completely getting rid of the harassment and humiliation that our entrepreneurs have to face from regulators on a daily basis, especially true for our MSMEs. It kills the entrepreneurial spirit. Across Southeast Asia, if countries became competitive, it was because they harnessed the entrepreneurial spirit that they have. Last but not the least, rescuing our trade promotion from the archaic 1980s approach that we somehow still seem to be, persisting with. And there are, I think Veena ji mentioned this, or Harsh ji mentioned this. There are excellent best practice examples in Korea and Taiwan and other countries, how they have completely transformed their approach to trade promotion. So if we do all of these basic things, then the larger industrial policy get addressed. That gives us, I think, confidence to negotiate trade agreements with much more greater confidence. I'll end there. Thank you for the opportunity for letting me speak.
Sorry, thank you very much, Preetam, for another very excellent intervention. May I request Pranav Kumar? What is the most? Pranav, are you there? What is the most?
Yes, I am.
Pranav used to work for CII. Now he's with the Reliance Industries as a trade strategist. What is the most prominent concern for Indian industry in relation to the trade-related physical and logistics infrastructure, and how can it be addressed? And you have 3 minutes. I mean, we have already crossed our time, but a few more minutes, I think.
I'll stick to that timeline. In fact,
sorry, Pranav. I hate to be a tail ender.
Not a problem. Yeah, because of course I got the opportunity to hear some of the good experts' advice on and
you don't have to repeat any of them.
No, definitely I will not repeat. In fact, on this also the trade logistics parts, you have also alluded, and Dr. Ahluwalia also mentioned that some good progress and policies have been implemented the last 7-8 years, and we are seeing the result. But one, the perennial problem and the complaint which industry has always been saying, that we are competitive at the factory gate, but once the products rolls out of the factory gate, then we become uncompetitive. So of course, the challenges which we are facing as an industry, more on the hard side of the infrastructure, because we have seen the progress over the last 7-8 years. Most of the problems have been well documented now. The Gati Shakti scheme, the new, very excellent new logistics policy which has been announced, a lot of problems have been documented as a part of National Committee on Trade Facilitation. So problems are well known, even there is a good intent on the part of the government also. But of course, when it comes to creating the hard infrastructure, then there comes the role of the state also, connecting to the port, the congestion at the port. So these are the major problems at a macro level. So in view of the positive time, I would not like to elaborate it further. But there are 2-3 points which I would like to emphasize here in the context of the discussion which has been going on for the last 2 hours. Last 1.5 years has been very eventful as far as trade policy debate and discourse is concerned. Because I exactly remember 6th of August last year, when Prime Minister addressed all the head of missions and industry members, plus senior officials. And that has really changed the gear or shifted the gear. And we have seen the result also, change in the FTA strategy. And secondly, of course, we achieved the historical milestone of 400 billion plus of exports. So that momentum has to be maintained. That's a major challenge. Once in a while you can achieve that. We achieved $300 billion of exports way back in 2009-10, but that we lost the momentum. Now we have crossed the 400 billion. So major challenge at our end, how to maintain that momentum. And there comes the role of GVC integration. I will not elaborate it because that has been discussed in length, But one point is that India is taking over the G20 presidency, and this issue is coming at the forefront. India is going to focus in a big way on GVC integration and how to make GVC more inclusive. Two more points. One on the exports. In fact, we all know that. In fact, Mr. Agarwal also mentioned about that our share in merchandise exports is less than 2%. But if you look at the major problem that over last several decades, we have been exporting the same set of products. The new addition only is the petroleum products. So what we have to do that we have to bring more high-tech, high-value-added products in the export basket that will help us to increase our share in merchandise exports. Next point is the services particularly, because that is also important. But of course, many speakers have also emphasized that manufacturing is important. That also I recognize, because manufacturing gives a lot of strength. It creates more productive jobs and all. But in services, our major challenge is that is high export concentration and high market concentration. We rely on just one product, that is IT-enabled services, and few markets. So we really need to diversify service export basket. Recently, the Commerce Minister has set up a target of $1 trillion of services export by 2030, $1 trillion of goods export by 2030. Particularly in services, the major challenge is if you look at the current composition, the 60% of the services export is realized through mode 3, that is investment, where we have very little.
Pranab, can I interrupt you? And this is not a seminar. I had asked you a specific question in terms of the recommendation for the trade policy. So if I may interrupt you, as we have already run out of time, and if you can conclude with the question about the question that was raised to you in terms of the trade-related physical and logistics infrastructure, and what do you think should be the policy recommendation?
No, that also already the new logistics policy has come up. That is Shakti scheme. So of course we have to implement it. So
right.
So
now, as somebody said, and this is for the benefit of all in the audience, there are three problems in our policy: implementation, and implementation. So we are aware of these three problems, and to find a solution is what we constantly ideate, we constantly badger the government, and so on. And we have Anup is here, at least from the government, or formally with the government, Ajay, and so on. And they are aware of the fact is the kind of badgering we've done, including often crossing swords also. But anyway, that is besides the point. Can I request Vishwanath? Vish, are you there?
No.
No. Nilanjan Bunny?
No.
Well, he's also gone. So I think, sorry, we've already run over time. Perhaps these people had other commitments. But I thought this was another very excellent discussion. And I leave it to my worthy colleague, Vipul Chatterjee, to summarize or to try and summarize and propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you. It won't take much time, 2.5 minutes precisely. I think in a sense, before I thank everybody, let me try to summarize. In a sense, Mr. Ahluwalia, in his very first point, summarized this discussion. That if we look at trade just in terms of balancing exports and import needs, then forget about it. Forget about any policy, forget about trade itself. So, and the discussion today and the previous ones precisely hammered that point again and again and again. That why do we need to look at trade in its larger context, its various nuances, etc., which we have taken note of, and we're going to utilize it, taking forward to relevant ministries, various players, etc. The second point, as Pradeep has just, I would say, reiterated, implementation. I think Vinaji has made some very, very important point in regard to the 4 pillars through which we should look at the implementation aspects of our trade and trade policy. In that context, I know maybe I'm making a slightly controversial statement that there is no shortcut. And this point has come up again and again, that we need to have very clear-cut policy in place, implementation plan, taking into account the views of a diverse set of stakeholders, including state governments, at the local stakeholders, etc., etc. And we have to work hard. There is no shortcut to that hard work. I think we are very fond of doing shortcut or taking shortcut methods. You go to any goal chakkar in any place in our country, you will see 2 or 3 two-wheelers trying to take that shortcut instead of taking the usual circular route. Anyway, I don't know from where that inspiration for that hard work would come. That can come from various places. It doesn't matter. It can come from Harvard. It can come from Haridwar. That doesn't matter actually. But there is no substitute for that. With that, let me thank all of you once again. And we're going to summarize this debate, very, very rich debate, in a logical manner, and taking it forward to DGFT and other important players in our trade policy establishment, and try to see that, yes, trade can be a major component of our, not just for our economic growth, but keeping in mind our larger national interest. With that, let me thank you once again. And I see Mr. Mehta is gone. Maybe he's gone for a break. Oh, he's here. So maybe the last word to him.
Vipul, you said it. So let me again thank all of you once again, particularly those who have already left. And we'll come back to you with, as Vipul said, with the outcome document. Thank you very much.